Hello, students. Welcome to Social Problems, Chapter 11, the Economy and Politics. Some of the things we're going to be discussing during this lecture, we're going to take a look at different types of economic systems, different types of political systems, the growth of corporations, special interest groups, lobbying groups, political action committees, also known as PACs, the differences between an elite perspective versus a pluralist perspective whenever you're looking at democracy and also voting. And lastly, we'll take a look at voting demographics. First off, let's talk about three different types of economic systems. The first one is capitalism, and this is the type of economic system that we have here in the United States. It is a market economy. So the prices of goods and services are heavily influenced by the market, also the law of supply and demand. If there is a very high demand for a particular product or a service, then that's going to drive those prices up. If there's a very low demand, then it can drive those prices down. So we, the citizens, are the ones who typically, based on our behavior, can also have a great effect on the prices of goods and services being high and low. But at the same time, we also have to take a look at the supply. If there's a high or a low supply, that can also have a dramatic effect on the prices of goods and services, especially if the supply is very low. It is a profit-based economic system with private ownership, which means that the majority of the industries are privately owned by U.S. citizens that are driven by profit. The next economic system is socialism. This has more of a mixed economy. So what that means is that there are some industries that are going to be privately owned by citizens that are going to be profit-based. A lot of times there's a misconception that in socialistic countries like Canada and various countries in Europe that there's not any businesses or organizations that are profit-based that are making a lot of money. That's not the case. So with a mixed economy, you have a combination of privately owned and publicly owned. So some of the publicly owned types of programs would be the healthcare system. In a lot of socialistic countries, they have universal health care where the government is heavily involved in those industries. So it's kind of a mixture of privately owned industries by the citizens and also publicly owned and controlled industries by the government. So because they do have more social programs, and social programs are funded through tax revenue, for example, the one I just gave you with universal health care, they do tend to pay higher taxes. Some examples of socialistic countries would be Sweden, the United Kingdom, Canada, and many other European countries. So if we're taking a look at the third type of economic system, is going to be communism. This is going to have more of a planned type of economy. This is going to be where the manufacturing of goods and services and the distribution of those goods and services are going to be highly planned and highly controlled by the government. All the industries are heavily controlled. So the prices of goods and services, the control over the supply is going to be heavy-handed by the government. An example of that would be Cuba and also North Korea. So an economic system has to do with the manufacturing, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, and how those products are taxed and how those taxes are used within that society. So that kind of moves us into political systems, which really deals more with power and governance over a society. Here in the United States, we have a democracy. Within a democracy, power is something that is given over by the American people through the electoral process. People elect people and they give them positions of power on the local level, on the state level, and on the federal level. The House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate. More on a local level would be with mayors, state governors, but also we hand over power to the Vice President and the President of the United States. This power is often limited in regards to term limits. These individuals can be voted in and out of office. The second one is a monarchy, and this is where power is inherited traditionally through the bloodline. Two main types of monarchies. For many, many hundreds of years, the vast majority of the world, if they had kings and queens, they had what's known as an absolute monarchy. Even in the United Kingdom and all over Europe, they had what's known as an absolute monarchy, where their power is unlimited. The king and the kingdoms will make the decisions over that particular country, and what they say goes. Today, the majority of absolute monarchies have moved, and they have over the centuries moved towards a constitutional monarchy. One example of an absolute monarchy is Saudi Arabia. A constitutional monarchy is different, though. It has a combination of kings and people that are within the monarchy that do have power, but it's limited. It's a combination of a monarchy and also elements of a democracy. This is called a constitutional monarchy, where they do have a constitution, and they typically will have a prime minister, which would be equivalent to the United States having a president. And so the United Kingdom would be a good example of this now. They moved from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. So the King of England and those people that are within that particular bloodline, they do have limited power. And so they'll have a prime minister that is voted in and out of office, and they're going to be involved in actually setting up the laws of the land. The third one is called an authoritarianism type of political system. This is going to be more of a dictatorship. So in an authoritarian type of environment, this is where power is typically taken. So one example of that would be North Korea, Kim Jong-un. So this is where power is taken by force, and within an authoritarian government, the government has absolute control over the economy, the politics, the religion, and also elements of society. An incredible amount of power concentrated to that particular dictator. Let's take a look at the growth of corporations. So during the Industrial Revolution that occurred here in the United States, there was a movement from small family businesses that grew and evolved into major corporations. One of the main reasons why this was able to happen is because the Industrial Revolution brought industry, assembly lines, manufacturing, and so goods could be manufactured much more quickly. They could be sold at a lower price because so much was being manufactured at one time, and they could be distributed worldwide. So small companies became very large corporations. During this time of the Industrial Revolution, there were certain types of companies that had a heavy amount of control over certain industries. So whenever you have one company or a corporation that controls an entire industry and they can dictate the supply and the price of that particular good, then that's called a monopoly. So for example, Andrew Carnegie with Carnegie Steel, controlling the steel industry. John D. Rockefeller, controlling the oil industry. J.P. Morgan, controlling the banking industry. Monopolies are illegal. And in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was put in place to break up monopolies. Because monopolies go against capitalism. And capitalism, it's a free market type of system. where various companies, they have to compete with each other to increase the quality and also driving down the cost of goods to compete with each other. It's called a free market type of system. And if you have one company or one corporation that has a monopoly over an entire industry, then they have way too much control, and it goes against capitalistic views and ideas. So antitrust types of laws are put in place to break up these monopolies. So when that happens is whenever monopolies tend to break up, sometimes they will form what's known as oligopolies. And there are many oligopolies here in the United States. And an oligopoly is whenever you have multiple companies and corporations that will have a lot of control over particular industries, but they're still competing with each other. For example, Microsoft and Apple competing with each other with the computer industry. AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, they have a large portion of the consumer base when it comes to that kind of technology. However, they are still competing with each other. Now, whenever it becomes a social problem or an issue, is whenever these oligopolies start working together, and if they're involved in what's known as price fixing, that's actually going to be illegal. And price fixing is whenever these companies work together to bring the price down so low that they'll drive out the little people, the smaller companies where they just can't compete. And then at the same time, they start to bring up their prices together in order to maximize profits. This is called price fixing, and it goes against the free market system, and it is illegal. Lastly, we'll talk about conglomerates, and conglomerate is a mother corporation. It's a massive corporation that owns many other smaller companies and corporations. So, for example, the Ford Company is a conglomerate. It also owns Volvo and Mazda. Yum Brands is a huge conglomerate. It owns KFC, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Long John Silver, A&W restaurants. A lot of times whenever we think about these types of fast food industries or fast food companies, we think that they're competing with each other, not fully understanding that there's a mother corporation that has bought all of them out. And so what this does is that if for some reason KFC has a bad quarter or Taco Bell has a bad quarter, but Pizza Hut or Long John Silver does really well, it kind of evens things out. So they don't have all their eggs in one basket. They're distributed out among many companies and corporations. So let's take a look at what's known as special interest groups. So special interest groups, these are groups that have a special interest in politics for different reasons. This may be a company or an organization that is concerned about the taxes that they pay. And so they want to make sure that they get somebody into Congress or somebody into the presidency that may believe in tax cuts for corporations that will better interest them. You have other types of special interest groups that are heavily concerned with certain types of civil rights, or religious organizations that is concerned about concepts like abortion, nonprofit organizations. They may be Democrat leaning, they may be Republican leaning, they may be independents. We also have the National Rifle Association, which makes sense that they would have a very special interest in protecting the Second Amendment. So these special interests, they are involved in politics because they know that politicians and those that are in the House of Representatives, those that are in Congress, those that are sitting in the White House, and those that are sitting in the Supreme Court, whether they are leaning left or they are leaning right, can have a direct effect on their particular cause. their business, their nonprofit, their religious beliefs, and also civil rights organizations. So what these special interest groups do is they get involved in lobbying groups and also political action committees. This is how they influence or shape politics. So lobbying groups, these are groups that are hired by special interest groups. So they're going to be hiring people that believe in their particular interest, whether it's civil rights of marginalized groups, certain religious beliefs, or huge companies and organizations that are trying to maximize profits. And they will strategically put these lobbying groups at various state capitals, like in Little Rock, Arkansas, and also at our nation's capital at Washington, D.C. And what they do is that they follow bills that are going through Congress or that are being looked at and potentially voted on. And they will usually try to lean on politicians in order to vote a certain way. So they have a presence there to try to influence that. Typically, what special interests do is that they not only create lobbying groups, but they also create PACs, which are known as political action committees. And they use their money to try to influence politics. Because in our country, politicians, whether it's on the state level or on the national level, they have to raise money, campaign, fundraising. A lot of people will send money themselves individually to certain candidates, but at the same time, large companies and organizations will often put in millions and millions of dollars to try to get a particular candidate on the state level, or a senator on the national level, or the presidency of the United States. And money makes a big difference. So if you have candidates that have a lot of money, well, that allows them to travel. That allows them to have debates. That allows them to create commercials. That allows them to kind of get into the public eye to help them win. And usually the candidate that is able to raise the most money, especially if it's a lot more money than the individual that they are campaigning against, they have a greater chance of being elected. But what this can do, this can create what's known as a conflict of interest, where the particular candidate or the representative who's in office, they may have certain beliefs and they may want to vote a certain way, but they also understand that there are special interest groups that are funding their campaign, that it's allowing them to sit there in that seat, that have helped them get where they are. So they have to try to find that balance between representing their constituents, the people that they represent, and also at the same time trying to keep happy, for a lack of better words, those companies and organizations that are funding their campaigns. Now that within itself is not illegal, just having that conflict of interest, that struggle. But what is illegal are bribes. And a bribe is transactional. And this is whenever a company or an organization or an individual will hand over money to somebody who's voting on a particular bill. And there's a transaction that, hey, we'll give you this money, but we need you to vote a certain way. It's transactional. It goes beyond the conflict of interest. It's if I give you money, or if I give you certain types of benefits, then you're going to be voting a certain way. That is bribery, and that is illegal in politics. So what this does, since there are issues of price fixing, briberies, conflicts of interest, it can kind of create various concerns among American citizens about the legitimacy and the security of our democracy. And that kind of falls into two different types of perspectives when it comes to how citizens view politics and politicians and even voting. And based on where you fall on either of these two perspectives can have a huge influence on on whether or not you are actively voting and actively participating in the voting process, in the political process, or if you're one of these individuals who think the voting doesn't count and you're not going to participate. So let's take a look at each one of these. First one is called the elite perspective. And this is where an individual believes that democracy does not exist. That the powers that be, they're going to put in office whoever they want to put in, and that basically senators and the president of the United States is just a front man or a front woman to somebody to represent that particular seat. And that the real power and the control belongs to small networks of small, powerful families, corporate leaders, and top military officials. So if you have this kind of perspective, then you probably have the belief that, my vote really doesn't count, it doesn't matter. Now, if you kind of move over to what's known as the pluralist type of perspective, you do believe that democracy exists. However, you also understand that there are other external forces that kind of shape perception of the American people. You understand that special interest groups are involved with creating lobbying groups and political action committees. You know that they're involved in social media, and they're trying to create a perception or a narrative to try to influence the American people to vote a certain way, often eliciting strong feelings of either patriotism, fear, or anger. Typically, those are huge driving forces for voting. Being angry, or being scared, or being patriotic. They're very strong emotional. So if you have this type of perspective here, that you understand that lobbying groups and PACs, they do try to influence and shape public opinion, politicians, political parties, yet in the end, the voters determine the winners and losers by their vote, then you're probably going to be the type of individual that is more politically active. And you do believe that your vote counts. But you also understand that external forces out there also are playing an influence in shaping perception. And if these external forces are out there trying to shape perception, that's why it's going to be incumbent enough and very important for us to critically think for ourselves. To understand that whatever we're seeing in social media or on the news or on the commercials may be a kernel of the truth, but it may not be all of it. So sometimes we have to kind of broaden our perspective and try to get more information and not just believe what somebody puts on a commercial because they're trying to influence the way that we vote. We have to think for ourselves. So let's take a look at some voting demographics. When it comes to education, voter turnout tends to increase as educational levels increase. So as people are more educated, they go from high school to college to graduate school. As education levels go up and even as income levels go up, political participation tends to rise. Voting participation tends to rise. And that's because there's a deeper understanding of the political process. There's a deeper understanding of how the political process and who is in power affects them directly. When it comes to sex, females vote at higher rates than males. When it comes to age, the highest voter turnout are those 60 years old and older. This comes with experience, this comes with wisdom, but this also comes with, around this age, you're also taking a hard look at securing Social Security and Medicare and making sure that the powers that be protect those. You want to make sure that those types of programs that they paid into for so long, they are still around because they're going to need it around this age. The lowest voter turnout are going to be among voters under the age of 25. So typically, as people get older, start raising a family, if they become more educated, they make more money, they're usually more interested in the political process and what's going on, and they're also more likely to vote. So let's take a look at voting and also criminal convictions. Over 5 million citizens are not allowed to vote due to felony convictions, which are serious crimes. Prisoners that are incarcerated in Vermont and Maine, they are actually allowed to vote. The other 48 remaining states do not allow incarcerated prisoners to vote. So it does vary from state to state. So if we take a look at convicted felons in the state of Arkansas, they are not allowed to vote until they are off probation, they're off parole, and all of their fines are paid in full. So it depends on what state you live in regards to how felony convictions can affect your ability to vote and be involved in the political process. So our final thoughts whenever we're looking at this chapter from an economic and a political perspective is that sociologists study economic and political systems regarding their functionality. On a macro level, large scale, for example, the societal impact of a monopoly, price fixing, political bribes, and oppressive dictators. More on a micro individual level, sociology studies the financial, the emotional, the psychological, and the social impact that government has on individual citizens, their families, in both positive and negative ways.